for example, how he's gone back and forth in his public statements. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, he says one policy. Then 3 days later, he changes it. Then 3 days later, he changes it again. And I mean, that certainly doesn't give a lot of confidence either to our allies or to, for example, the countries who are considered our adversaries. And so, I mean, the American government is in a very disorganized state right now, which obviously is dangerous for the world.
Frankly speaking, one of the most important characteristics of Trump's second terms is we finding a gap between the perceptions from peoples and the real performance of Trump's teams. When he win the election again, one of the most important prediction of his second team is people wish that this guy will become more matured, which means he grow up, got enough confidence, enough experience when he take this office for first terms, and then he will become more experienced to deal with those very complicated or sophisticated issues represented by Russia and Ukraine conflict. But the reality is, seeing that these guys, the only experience he got from his first team is he believed he understand everything. The only mistake for his first teams is he did not pick the right guys to realize, to deliver his own really ideas. He just find these people did not loyalty to him enough. And so he just picked a teams. Its first priority is whether you are loyalty to Trump himself or his personal enough or not. Did not consider whether these guys are qualified for their positions. Did not consider too much on their real skills or experience to dealing with these sophisticated and complex things. The challenge here is Trump himself did not have a very proper or comprehensive training on IR relations or diplomatic knowledges or skills. He did not even have first-hand experience by doing diplomatic ways, which means you need patient, long-term goals, have a very detailed, pragmatic, path designing skills to realize the goal. He just mentioned the goal. I wish I have a goals. I wish in my understanding, these things can be solved in these ways. He didn't even have the so-called those sense of geopolitics, which means this guy refused to recognize that the issues like Ukraine-Russia conflict has a long history background, is very complicated. There's too many actors, they are interesting, involved. They cannot act according to a very simple orders from Washington, from the White House. In short, he is not the only dominators of these games. He must consider other actors' requirement for their own interest and so on. So you'll find something, his behavior, how to say, you can say that this behavior is ridiculous, but sometimes you just find these guys, they are not got the sense. He don't have any sense. What he say, when he say that I can finish or stop the conflict in the first 24 hours when he take the office take the White House again, it's just like that. He called Putin. Putin say, "Hey, you guys, welcome back. I will send you a gift. Let's stop these ceasefires." And he call to the Kiev, say, "If you don't stop the fight, I will cut off this intelligence and military." So boom, you did and done everything just after these two calls. It's a very idealized scenarios, which is, frankly speaking, mission impossible in the real world. But the challenge here is Trump is too quickly to say his idea out without considering how to deliver these plans. And such kind of mission impossible proposals, he also providing a very high political reputations, like a gambling on it. So here comes the challenges. If he cannot deliver these proposals, he will losing face and got and disadvantages in US domestic political structures. But on the other side, if he insisted these proposals, he don't have enough of proper persons and the policy tools to deliver that proposals. Frankly speaking, in my point of views, if Trump want to launch this ceasefire, the experience from Nixon in Vietnam War is quite clear. At phase one, you should not cut off the aid to the Ukraine. You need to increasing your military aid to Ukraine and help Ukraine to rebuild the balance in the battlefield and raising the pressure to the Moscow so that Moscow will have the willing to sink these ceasefire considerations. But what he did is very different. In Munich, before he launched the negotiate with Russia, he just showed his every card. He said that this war you cannot win. We will not continue to invest from the Ukraine side. And that deliver a very clear signals to Russia side. If the Russia just keep moving on the battlefield and just wait, and finally, I will get everything we want. Frankly speaking, the second terms of Trump administrations, he still did not really learn any useful things from his first terms, and it's providing too much uncertainties, not only to United States, not only to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, but maybe to the whole world, not only on the geopolitical issues, but also on the comprehensive U.S. foreign policy framework will become filled with too much uncertainties in the coming 4 years.
I generally agree with that. In other words, the truth is Trump simply, doesn't have a solid understanding of these issues. And the problem is many of the people he's picked, for example, his defense secretary, Hespeth. I mean, basically, he was simply a talking head, a pundit on Fox News. And I mean, he doesn't have any experience. The Secretary of Defense right now is somebody who has no experience running a large organization. He doesn't really know any of these issues. And the same thing with many of the other people that he's brought in, like, even Marco Rubio, for example, or Secretary of State. I mean, Marco Rubio basically was a senator who focused heavily, for example, on Cuban policy, on some Latin American issues. And he doesn't really have the diplomatic experience that, for example, the foreign ministers of Russia or China or many other countries around the world have. So, I mean, again, it's really a government made up of people who don't have, I think, a good understanding of what's going on in the world and don't have a lot of experience. And in fact, people sometimes who do have a certain amount of experience, who do have a certain amount of knowledge, are simply blocked from holding any positions because, certain, foreign policy groups block them. For example, basically a former general, a commenter was picked by Tulsi Gabbard to be the briefer for the president of the morning. And he'd come out and criticized some of the ongoing slaughter of the Israelis in Gaza. And, once that came out, basically he was blocked from any appointment. So the problem is American foreign policy, or the American government in general, is under the control of a number of different powerful groups that can veto anybody who offends them on any given issue. And so, given all these sorts of vetoes, what you many times then get are the sort of people in place who don't really know what they're doing. And I mean, that certainly applies to Donald Trump. I mean, in fact, when you look at, for example, how he's gone back and forth in his public statements, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, he says one policy. Then 3 days later, he changes it. Then 3 days later, he changes it again. And I mean, that certainly doesn't give a lot of confidence either to our allies or to, for example, the countries who are considered our adversaries. And so, I mean, the American government is in a very disorganized state right now, which obviously is dangerous for the world. And, obviously, I think what we really should be doing is simply going for a peace agreement in Ukraine based on the terms as close as possible to what we could have gotten years ago with the Russians. In other words, a neutralized, demilitarized Ukraine that does not become part of NATO. That's what the Russians have demanded. That would be, I think, a reasonable solution to us, and it certainly would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives because this war wouldn't have broken out. So, I mean, I really think, the American government is simply entirely it doesn't really know what it's doing on these issues. And the problem is many of these same foreign policy groups control both political parties in the United States. So, for example, in many ways, there's sometimes more of a continuity between Democrats and Republicans than the voters expect when they vote for the other side. And so I think, America is just in a very difficult position right now in foreign policy in these issues. And, I certainly hope we can get a peace agreement with the Russians over the Ukraine. And, we can certainly reestablish normal relations with Russia. But it's a difficult thing given that the Trump team doesn't seem to know what they're doing.